We're going to stand by here for a few minutes and let others join the room, and then we'll get started. I am going to place everyone on mute, including our speakers, and once the speakers get started, they'll take themselves off mute. Devika, if you could please mute everyone, and also just want to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded. I'll take myself off of mute, and if everyone can please just stay on mute. Again, we will give another minute here until we get started, just to allow the latecomers to join, and we'll get started here shortly. Okay, well, I think we're about 3 minutes here behind, so we will get started. And you know what? I just accidentally turned off my computer. Let me do this. Let me give a couple welcoming announcements. I do want to introduce my speakers, and I just accidentally turned off my computer. This is the world of working in COVID, by the way, is all these technical issues that can come up. So thank you for having patience for us. My name is Amy Hariani. I'm Vice President here at the U.S.-India Business Council, helping support our legal services committee work. I'm really delighted today that we have with us 4 experts on the FCPA front that are going to share with us some insights into how we, as lawyers, as in-house counsel, and as policy leads, deal with some of the challenges and new developments to our business as a result of the COVID pandemic. Perhaps most notably do we see on the COVID side of things is disruptions to the supply chain. And of course, we see supply chain diversification and movement outside of China. Some of that was actually pre-COVID and pre-kind of pandemic as a result of other trade issues. And, you know, other things were accelerated from that. Of course, COVID also accelerated some of those trends because as China was the first country to be hit by some of this, we, you know, saw them shut down first, saw some of the supply chains shut down as a result of that. And people started to question, not only because of the trade issues, but because of any other natural disaster that could come up, you know, potential disruptions to supply chain could happen. And in order to mitigate risk, we ought to look at diversifying supply chain in order to prevent something like this from happening. So in working with a lot of our members at the U.S.-India Business Council, we recognize that companies are looking to diversify their supply chain and you know, move product outside of China, but other places as well into other markets. I know India is looking to capture some of that movement, but in all of that, in the supply chain disruptions, in the movement of supply chains, other ancillary issues are also emerging. And FCPA and corruption issues is definitely one of them. As you look to new suppliers, knowing your supplier, knowing who you're working with, and knowing the market is going to become more important than ever as you look to manage risk that comes with entering new markets and new partners. So with that, as I mentioned, we have 4 experts with us today, and I'm going to apologize to them because my computer crashed and I don't have their bios, but I am going to share a little bit with you all later, and at least just let me wing it with them. Again, I know everyone's working in home offices and may have other distractions around, so we are going to keep everyone on mute. Would request that everyone please keep your mics and cameras on mute until later. For questions, you are able to use the chat box to go ahead and ask your question at any time. We will either get to the question in conversation, and we'll also save some time at the end for the conversation as well. So we have Deepak Nambiar, who's joining us from Kelly Dry, along with his colleague Eric, who's an FCPA expert. We have Keshav, who's general counsel and legal counsel from Microsoft. Thank you so much. Rahul from Fortitude Law in India, and Rajesh Tripathi with, if I'm going to get it right, Rajesh, Witham, if I'm saying it right, sharing some experts and insights onto accounting. And I'm apologizing again to my speakers as I was going to more properly introduce them, but my computer crashed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deepak, who's been a wonderful friend of mine and a great supporter of USIBC. I couldn't thank him enough for helping me to put together this program to get us started. Again, I want to remind everyone that today's program is being recorded. And if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box. And otherwise, we'll keep everyone on mute. So Deepak, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and get us started.
Thank you, Amy. Good to see everyone. Again, welcome and thank you for the opportunity to the audience and the participants for on this panel discussion. What we thought was, why don't we take a few minutes just for the panelists to kind of introduce themselves in a little more detail, and then talk about their areas of expertise and what they are seeing in the FCPA world. And probably we can throw open this to some questions. So no order of importance. Maybe Eric, if you want to go first from a US FCPA perspective, that'll be great.
Absolutely. Thanks, Deepak. Really appreciate the introduction. My name is Eric McClafferty. I'm a partner at Kelly Dry. I was at the State Department for a while, but I've been at Kelly Dry for about 24 years doing international trade law. This is such an unusual situation. We have basically an international emergency, and that's put huge pressure on supply chains, as we just heard, inbound side, outbound side. Pressure to move not just PPE, protective equipment, but all kinds of other products, and companies facing, economic disaster because they can't get the supplies that they need to manufacture and keep their people at work. And so that puts a huge amount of pressure on companies to move products around, move technologies, move services around. And in the face of that pressure, they're running into regulations, import regulations, outbound regulations. And that means that they're trying to get around those regulations in a variety of different ways. And not just companies, but also third parties are trying to help companies deal with these regulatory issues. And sometimes those folks find government officials with their hands out, looking for kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get rich or make some money, leveraging this emergency situation, or they're tempted to offer payment to a foreign official. And that generates risk, a lot of risk on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act side, which is the U.S. criminal statute that prohibits payments of bribes to foreign officials to assist in obtaining or retaining business. When we say payments, we're talking about really something much broader than just a money bribe. It also covers gifts, lavish entertainment. Most recently, we had a whole series of cases on internships that were offered to foreign government official children and relatives. It can also cover charitable donations. So don't just think of a bag of money being exchanged as coverage under these rules. Now, one of the big issues for this discussion, and we'll circle back to this in a minute, is who's covered. So issuers of securities in the United States are covered, but it's not just companies that sell their stock on U.S. exchanges. There's also American depository receipts, and there's lots of non-U.S. companies that have ADRs on U.S. exchanges. They're covered. Domestic concerns, that's a business in the United States, and also individuals in either who are citizens, nationals, residents of the United States, or somebody who happens to find themselves in the United States, they're covered. And you say, well, Eric, look, there's all these enforcement cases. Actually, the majority of large enforcement cases are against non-U.S. companies. $1 billion, $800 million penalties against companies that aren't really headquartered in the United States. And part of that is because there's been really incredibly aggressive enforcement and a very broad reading of the jurisdiction under the FCPA by both agencies that enforce it. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how the rule is set up. So there's a set of bribery provisions that are enforced by the Department of Justice. But there's also this following, in lots of ways, books and records provisions that the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, enforces. That covers issuers. Under those provisions, you need to keep your books and records transparently and also have a set of internal controls. And so there are two ways to get tripped up here. You could get pulled into a DOJ prosecution, or you may not record a bribe properly in your books and records, and so the SEC could come after you. And it seems counterintuitive that you would record a bribe as a bribe, but if you don't, you kind of wind up in that situation that Al Capone wound up in, where he didn't get prosecuted for some of the violent criminal activities he was involved in. He got prosecuted for tax evasion. So it's similar to that. So the payment issue as well is you don't actually have to complete the payment. If you offer, authorize, promise a payment, you can have a violation. So if you're an executive and you know about somebody making a bribe payment, that can get you in a lot of trouble. So the other big issue here is that this covers direct and indirect activities. So third parties create a lot of risk for companies. So if you have agents, if you have distributors who are acting on your behalf, that can create a lot of FCPA risk. So there's really, and you see this a lot. So there are folks out there saying, listen, I have fantastic contacts in country. I have great contacts in the government. I can help you sell in this location. That's a bit of a red flag. So, what about these contacts that these folks have in the government is so special? Are they passing along some of the commission that you're paying them to a government official? So you've got to do a lot of diligence on third parties. One of the big things to understand about the FCPA is it really focuses on discretion. So you need to be influencing a foreign official to use their discretion to direct business to your company. That brings up this issue of facilitation payments. So there's this out. A lot of people have heard about facilitation payments. Well, I can make a payment to a foreign official to do something that he's obligated to do anyway. So issue a visa, help me get a license in place that they have to issue to me anyway. That's dangerous territory. It's a very narrow exception, so you got to be really careful there. There's some other affirmative defenses to the FCPA. It's okay under the written law of the country, then it's not an FCPA violation. Well, how many countries have rules that say that you can bribe their officials? That's really something that you can't depend on to shape your behavior in this area. There's also a better affirmative defense, which is reasonable and bona fide promotional expenses. And we see this a lot in the travel area. So you can make payments to a foreign official to travel to your facilities, to inspect them, to look at products, that kind of thing. But you have to be really careful in that area. There's lots of abuse, lots of people with their hands out saying, hey, I'd like to stop in Las Vegas or Disney World, and I need $10,000 to gamble at the table. So there's lots of red flags in that area. You need to be careful. And why do you need to worry about this? Well, it's a criminal set of provisions, and for corporations, they can get a $2 million penalty per violation. Individuals can get $100,000 per violation or go to jail for 5 years for every violation. The civil penalties don't look huge, in comparison to the criminal penalties. That's why the agencies really rely on the criminal penalties. On the books and records side, you think, oh, well, that's just books and records, but the penalties are bigger. So there's $25 million corporate penalty per violation. Individuals get $5 million penalty for books and records violations. There's also disgorgement. So a lot of the money that's going to the U.S. government in these settlement cases involves disgorgement. So if you get caught, you have to give the U.S. government the benefit that you got out of paying this bribe. Not only that, it's really rare that there's one violation. So what you typically see is some kind of a pattern where there's multiple violations. And so that's where you see these gigantic penalty numbers. Lots of enforcement cases in the pharma area, healthcare, oil and gas. There's been some big cases involving India recently. Cognizant Technology is one of the leading cases there. Involved millions and millions of dollars in penalties and disgorgement. DOJ has issued some enforcement guidelines in 2017 and updated those in 2019. Really, what they did is incentivize companies to voluntarily disclose violations. So if you find one or more violations, they've said, listen, if you voluntarily disclose those to us, if you cooperate, you fix the situation, you remediate, in general, we're going to decline to prosecute you. I mean, you may get a penalty out of the situation, you may get a monitorship, or you may be required to do some reporting to DOJ and or the SEC, but we're not going to criminally prosecute you unless we find some really significant aggravating factors. Even then, you get executive misbehavior, that type of thing. You can still very often, if you disclose, avoid a major criminal penalty. And that can be really important for companies, especially if you want to do business with the U.S. government. You risk debarment from being able to do business with the U.S. government if you get in that situation. The other thing that's important to recognize in the enforcement side is that DOJ and SEC have been expanding the kinds of charges that they've been levying against companies. So they look at the FCPA provisions right off the bat, but then they also look at money laundering. They look at a variety of other different charges, and they've been levying those and using those in cases. And lots of enforcement in 2019. There were $2.6 billion in corporate fines. There were more than 70 active investigations. And what do they look at? They're looking at a whole variety of things, the areas that I talked about. And if they're doing an investigation, one of the things they're looking at is your compliance program. So was the compliance program well designed in the first place? Is it implemented effectively and in good faith? Is it working in practice? So is it just something sitting up on a shelf and, you go to show it to an enforcement agent who visits the company, and you got to blow the dust off of it. And the one message that I really want to get through here today, and I'm almost done, but one message I really want to get through is this is a kind of an area where it's an absolute no-brainer to have an enforcement and compliance policy in place in your company. You get huge credit under the criminal sentencing guidelines and the civil penalty guidelines if you've got an FCPA compliance program in place. So not only does it help your company comply, help get your employees trained, but if you've got that written compliance program in place and something happens in this area, you get a lot of credit for it. And human beings are human beings. You can't control everybody's behavior. Somebody in your organization might be out there doing something that doesn't match up with your compliance program. But if you don't have that good, solid, updated written compliance program in place, you're really risking yourselves unnecessarily, and it's not that hard to get right. Okay, one last thing, and that is, let's say I'm an Indian company. How far does FCPA jurisdiction reach? Maybe I sell in the United States. Maybe I've got distributors in the United States or an selling agents in the United States. or I've got some business contacts in the United States. Does that mean my worldwide behavior is covered by the FCPA? And it seems like that might be the case if you look at some of these enforcement actions that have been prosecuted by DOJ in particular on the bribery side, but the SEC also. And it's true that they do need some connection to U.S. commerce to prosecute a case, but it doesn't have to be much. Emails that touch the U.S., phone calls that touch the U.S. In the old days, I would have said faxes. Dollar-denominated transactions can be enough contact with the U.S. to help trigger FCPA jurisdiction. And the U.S. has got an incentive to look at global multinationals and get their corrupt behavior under control, so that U.S. companies that may not be bribing foreign officials can compete on a more level playing ground. That's the story that you hear from DOJ officials and SEC officials, and that's one of the reasons that we who advise foreign non-U.S. companies, Indian companies and others, say, listen, it's a great idea to get something in place to protect yourself here. That's all I've got right now. Happy to take questions later.
All right. Thanks so much, Eric. That was informative. I think we should go to Keshav Dhakat, who's the General Counsel of Microsoft India. Keshav, thank you again for joining. Definitely do share your perspective as a General Counsel, but also what are the challenges that you see with respect to third-party compliance during these COVID-related times when there's a lot of shift between let's say from China to India, right? So people are moving supply chains from one country to the other. And how are you seeing in-house teams like yours dealing with these situations? Keshav, I think you're on mute. We don't.
I was just going to say, yeah, Keshav, if you could unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you.
Got it.
Thank you,
Yep.
Deepak. Appreciate it. I just said, welcome to everybody who's on this call on an important topic like anti-corruption and supply chain. And it's very clear, Deepak, that there's an extraordinary level of business pressure all around due to the pandemic. And that does include challenges around compliance, besides business continuity, with remote employees and remote business partners, right? While remote working is a new normal, it certainly comes with compliance and regulatory challenges. And modern supply chain is a complex web of third parties. You have business partners, distributors, suppliers, manufacturers, and so on and so forth. Then you have jurisdictions. And then how do you manage those expectations and behavior of the business partners and third parties is critical. And as Eric was mentioning, the majority of the CPA enforcement action does involve misconduct or misadventure by third parties. So for us as a global corporation, and I'm responsible for all Microsoft subsidiaries and business units in India. Risk is always there, in emerging markets. So in that environment, I think messaging from the top management is absolutely critical when we are all working remotely. And I think second is for us to, we are leveraging our own strong technology footprint and expertise to effectively connect with partners, impart trainings, having a regular cadence. And you have to leverage the digital technology to ensure that there is, a least gap or no gap at all. So it's very important when you think of the supply chain and the two areas which we absolutely focus upon. How do you onboard suppliers and what kind of vetting do you do? And very clearly, there has been a shortage of suppliers and lack of manpower because of the migration issues. And there is a growing demand for third-party resources. And that is where there's a high risk of, bypassing the comprehensive onboarding and vetting processes, which could open up all types of risk. And the risk is of shortening the vetting cycle as well. As a corporation, we have to be super careful about. One way we are looking at is, looking at our existing vetted partners. How much of those partners can step in to manage supply chain and that would avoid working with unknown or untested or improperly screened entities that are out there. Even with new partners, you have to make sure that your due diligence checks are all risk-based. And business teams should be trained and sensitized about the risk of working with an unvetted supplier or a partner, a very critical element to message out. Another risk that we are looking into is around the repetitive and low cognitive skill works. And due to shortage of manpower in cities, it has led to labor issues, unsafe conditions in the supply chain, and things that may not be aligned to your company's values and social responsibility. So you have to pay that extra attention towards your vendor and supplier contracts and how they are drafted. Right, and in terms of the due importance you give to the compliance with your, company code of conduct or standard of business conduct that you have, and that is where employing a risk-based approach to diligence and screening is very, very critical, and you don't want to be in a situation where the impact of COVID is aggravated by further legal and PR risk, which result from transactions with unreputable and verified parties. So Microsoft, we more than a platform of technology, we are a platform of trust. This is the number one, I would say a leading indicator of our success is, are we able to run our businesses in full compliance? Are we able to have trusted environment within the partners in our supply chain? Because we also want to make sure that we are appropriately notified of any violations or any missteps that may have happened. So that's what I would say in terms of how we are managing and looking at all kinds of new risk areas in the supply chain side of things.
Thanks, Keshav. One question that came to mind. You talked about the challenges regarding connectivity and communications, right? Especially in the COVID era. And one thing which comes to mind is the typical whistleblower mechanism that you may have in place. So that someone can notify you if something is amiss in the supply chain, or there's an issue of corruption between some of the contractors, etc. Now, in today's world where that communication levels of lines of communication probably are not that frequent or disrupted to a certain extent, what additional measures would you suggest to corporations like yours, right, so that they can take as a diligence mechanism so that process continues unhindered?
Sure, Deepak. Let me just link with what I earlier said. I think in this environment of challenges and not able to really kind of connect in person or meet in person, right? And people are working remotely and connected from their homes. For a strong visible program is super critical. That red flags get reported in a timely manner, despite there's no personal connect with each other, because the business environment is undergone a tremendous change, and it starts with what kind of environment one creates inside the ecosystem beyond the awareness on policies and regulations and how we must conduct business the right way. But the awareness around the compliance program, and then people will face dilemmas. People will face issues which they don't have clarity on, or they don't know if it's a business risk or it's a legal risk or a compliance risk, right? And in that case, it's very important that people get the right safe environment to speak up. Whenever there's the case in doubt, there are venues in place. They can speak to compliance team, they can speak to finance teams, legal team, and HR and their managers. Even going all the way to the top management is a critical line of enablement that we do inside the company. And of course, there are anonymous ways in which people can report compliance in case they want to kind of just keep their identity private. And it is that environment that makes all the big difference, because people may not put their neck out in these times of crisis, and there's stress in the environment. So it is very important for the companies to go the extra mile and create that safe environment for people to speak up and have that confidence in the ecosystem that there is no retaliation measures, and then people treat them with respect. And I think with respect comes that everyone who supports investigations, everyone who supports compliance, they should feel that they're not putting themselves at risk, but they are helping the company they're helping themselves, they're helping their teams, their peer groups, and overall creating that environment that is helping the company stay safe and do business the right way. Deepak, I'll just mention some clear challenges in the investigation side of things. First thing first, you have to conduct interviews online, and that has multiple challenges already. First of all, of course, you have to have good technology. We absolutely use unified communication and collaboration platforms, which is just beyond just having a VC system. And that's where Microsoft Teams really helps us organize information and maintain security and privacy. And that's a critical part of it. Because for an investigator, the challenge is how do you discuss sensitive topics which you would typically do in person in a closed room, right? How will you discuss documents and emails, which in face-to-face you can exchange and you can do a lot of depth engagement? How do you read body language, in a virtual call, and when people don't want to do a virtual call, they just want to have an audio call, right? How do you share sensitive information, confidential information over VC and over emails? And it has leakages risk as well. So while things, I would say, have slowed down a bit on the investigation front because of these real life challenges, it is important that companies stay focused on these areas and not defer them to the future. So while you're absolutely managing the business growth and customer and partner engagements and driving the company forward, investigation work should continue. You should allow more and more escalations and people to raise dilemmas and the issues, what they notice, what they see, and the disciplinary process and decisions are not delayed. And this is where Microsoft is absolutely focused upon. We are double down on messaging and improving our digital processes to drive more and more escalations and ensuring that the company and the people each of them carry the shoulder of earning, building, and nurturing the trust in the company.
Thank you, Keshav. Thank you, Keshav. That's really helpful. I think we probably will come back to Keshav and Eric in a few minutes. But before that, let's turn to the two other panelists, Rahul Mahajan and Rajesh Tripathi. So Rahul, you're next. So why don't you please tell us about the India side of the Bribery Act?
Sure. Thank you, Deepak. Good morning, good evening, everyone. As Eric said that in US, you have the FCPA. In India, we have the similar regulation, which is Prevention of Corruption Act. And Prevention of Corruption Act has all the elements which Eric discussed. So I'm not going to repeat, but just to take a couple of them. For example, it has a very wide range. It covers all the agents, the third-party intermediaries, and at the same time, this act is something which has criminal consequences. So the main challenge what we have seen in this act is that till 2015, you will be shocked to know that in India, it was only the bribe taker who used to get prosecuted and not the bribe giver. So now in 2015, the government realized that this is not the right thing. And then they changed the act. And now they have made bribe giver also as a party where they can be prosecuted. So that is one. Second thing is, unlike other anti-corruption acts which we have seen, in India, we do not use the word bribe or we do not use the word money. It's a typical word which is gratification. So they say it is a legal gratification or a illegal gratification, which means that the scope is very wide. And at the same time, it applies to direct, indirect, gifts, money. So money is not the only criteria, similar to what we have seen in the case of FCPA. In addition to that, if we see the main difference between FCPA and Prevention of Corruption Act is that in FCPA, you can have a deferred prosecution agreement with the regulators, whereby the prosecution can be deferred and you pay the amount, the penalties, and the government, the DOJ will look at the compliance to see whether you are doing everything right, and then they can get back. But in case of Prevention of Corruption Act, we do not have the concept of any deferred prosecution agreement. So it is basically the prosecutors, they are going to file a complaint before the court, and then the court is going to take cognizance of that. So these are the important points in the Indian Corruption Act. The imprisonment, basically, if we see that the penalties are very stringent. So it is 3 to 7 years imprisonment and also fines. So 3 years is for something which we say for abatement, and 7 years is something when the court can conclude, or if there is a final judgment which will say yes, these guys have indulged in corrupt practices, and that is how the court will charge them with 7 years of imprisonment. One more distinction, as Eric said, that there are large fines, by the DOJ or SEC on the corruption cases. The Indian Act is very silent, so which means that the Prevention and Corruption Act, it does not provide for any minimum or maximum fine. So it is basically the sole discretion of the judge at that point of time to go ahead and pass the verdict with the fine. So these are the critical issues which are different from the US FCPA. The only thing is that we do not have the extraterritorial reach how we have seen in case of FCPA. So that is also an important point to note. One of the today's discussion is basically disruption in supply chain, and also at the same time companies are looking at India. So Keshav has already said about the due diligence program and the compliance which is happening. And at the same time, what we can see is that in India, if someone needs to appoint the suppliers in India, I think then the most important thing is screening of the vendors, which are very important. Once the screening of the vendors is done, then I think you have to do some past due diligence to see whether the vendors were involved in any earlier cases, or whether there was some labor violation, whether there was some sort of corrupt practices where they were indulged. Once that is done, then I think the most important thing is that you need to have a plan where they will comply with the code of conduct, and also at the same time they will see that the contracts which they are entering with the companies, foreign companies, you should have all the clauses and the undertakings which says that you will comply and the vendors will comply with that, because those are the only good defenses before the court of law in case any of your agent or a third party is indulged in any corrupt practices.
And actually, Rahul, if I could just interrupt, it looks like Govind Singh maybe accidentally hit something to request control of his computer. So Govind, if I could ask you please to revert back your screen so that everyone can see the speakers, I would be grateful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and I think everyone is still on mute. Okay, so Rahul, please continue.
Yeah. So those were the main differences between the US FCPA and the Indian Prevention of Corruption Act, which I was just highlighting. Deepak.
So thanks so much, Rahul. A couple of questions, and this is one for my own personal curiosity. Maybe it's a question for you and Eric. So oftentimes what I've seen in India is that there's a deferred prosecution agreement in the US, as you said, right? And then someone in India is monitoring those actions, and the government of India picks up steam and then starts prosecution in India for the bribery that happened in India, right? So, on one hand, for a US corporation, that seems a bit silly because, hey, the reason why they entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the DOJ is to kind of have a leniency in penalties and try to kind of get this behind them, right? But on the other hand, that doesn't necessarily get the corporation off the hook for the actions that will follow in India by the Indian government. Now, do you see, both from the US perspective and Indian perspective, some kind of a consolidation or some kind of, I guess, cooperation, I guess, for a lack of a better term, between the governments of the US and India to kind of see if they can reconcile the two prosecutions so that it's not almost not, a separate prosecution in India every time something happens in the US?
Right. Thank you, Deepak. I think this is a very practical and good question. So let me answer that. What happens is that the Department of Justice, once they close the settlement, they put that on the website. And from there, the Indian embassy in US, they pick up what type of investigation, if any Indian party is involved. And then they forward that to the Ministry of Home in India. Once it comes to the Ministry of Home, then a first information report is filed in an Indian court. So to answer your question, yes, they have to go through two different jurisdiction and two different court processes. So US is different, India is different. Because what happens is that they see where the crime has been committed. So, for example, if the bribe has been given in India, then the Indian courts will have the jurisdiction, notwithstanding the fact whether there has been a DPA in US or whether there has been imprisonment in US. But you have to again go through the same process in India, and then the Indian courts will take cognizance of that. That is one. Second thing is that in case of fines, yes, the Indian courts will impose fines and penalties, but they are not going to be as large as they are going to be for the US courts to impose. The second part is on the imprisonment. So there is a very funny law between India and US, and which we have seen that is, if someone is getting imprisonment in US, then basically the Indian government will ask for the extradition of that person so that it can be, it can come to Indian courts and the courts can take the next step of giving him the imprisonment. But there's a very funny law on that. The US courts and the US government says that if a person has been convicted for the offense in US, then they will not accept the extradition of that person, request of that person from India or any part of the world, which means that if suppose X has been already imprisoned in US for the same offense, they will not send that person to India to go and get the imprisonment. But yes, for the fine and all, the answer is yes. Both the courts can impose fine. In fact, Eric will be able to tell more, but there's a very interesting line in all the DPS and the investigations we have done. We have seen that the Department of Justice or the SEC will always write one line saying that the company, the US company has to cooperate with all the investigating agencies in all the countries worldwide. That is also one of the most important points they have to show after 3 years when they go and show their conduct to the government of US, to DOJ, that yes, they have cooperated with all the law enforcement agencies worldwide. So that's how it's important.
Yeah, I'll just add a few things to what Rahul was saying, which is right on the money. And this relates to how you conduct your internal investigation. You really need to think about these issues at the point that you've done an internal investigation and you're trying to decide, am I going to do voluntary disclosure to government authorities, or am I not going to disclose this behavior? I'm going to take a risk that the government authorities won't find out, or I won't have a whistleblower, a disgruntled employee, I won't have a competitor turn me in for this, And so you really need to think about all the ramifications of doing disclosure or not doing disclosure, and plan it out the entire way. And in the U.S., there's this discussions about global settlements, and that global settlement idea is really thinking about, okay, well, I have some sanctions violations, I've got some FCPA violations, I've got Commerce Department export control violations. Should I go to all the U.S. agencies and do a global disclosure? Well, that's not enough. You need to think through, as Rahul was saying, do I need to disclose to the local government entities where I've got violations, and think about that cooperation process and how you're going to engage in it. So that's why it makes sense if you have violations, it often makes sense to get somebody in the room with you who's been through these processes a few times. Sometimes individual companies haven't been through the investigative process. They don't know all the steps, but if you have somebody that's been through these situations many, many times, they can help you strategize all the way to the end game.
Thanks, Eric. I think we'll turn to Raj Tripathi, who heads the India practice, or with them, one of the prominent tax and accounting firms. So Raj, from a tax and accounting perspective, as it relates to FCPA and corruption in general, now we'd love to hear from you, please.
Thanks, Deepak. Really appreciate it, and good morning, everybody. So as Eric and Rahul talked about, that the US FCPA includes not only the anti-bribery things, but they also focus on the accounting provisions. And what the accounting provisions require is that the US or foreign public companies that are listed on the US stock exchange or which are required to file reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission, also known as the issuers that Eric had alluded earlier, they need to keep their accurate books and records, and they're also required to maintain an adequate system of internal accounting controls. In addition to that, one more thing that I would really like to stress over here is that under the accounting provisions is that it prohibits individuals and businesses from knowingly falsifying books and records or knowingly circumventing or failing to implement a system of internal controls. And what we have seen is that the payment of bribes often occurs in companies that have weak internal control environments. Internal controls is basically a process of financial reporting, and that is used by companies to provide reasonable assurances regarding the feasibility of reasonable assurances regarding the reliability of financial reporting and the preparation of financial statements. They also include various components such as, for example, control environment that covers the tone set by the organization, regarding integrity and ethics, risk assessments, control activities that cover policies and procedures designed to ensure that management directives are carried out, for example, approvals, authorizations, reconciliations, and segregation of duties. Also, the failure to prevent and detect bribery can result in enormous penalties, reputational damage, and prison time. It's very important for an organization to have an anti-corruption risk assessment, internal controls for high-risk activities, and also making sure that ongoing transactions are monitored and there's a proper data monitoring being done. Companies also have an obligation to investigate potential red flags of bribery by conducting their own investigation or hiring an independent third party such as forensic accountant who can assist with conducting interviews, transactions, records testing, and electronic data review with the goal of identifying outliers and potential corruptions, and also red flag any of those issues, Now, switching from internal control, one big aspect that companies overlook is that any individual or companies who violate the FCPA rules may also violate the US tax law, which a lot of times, companies don't realize that you're also, if you're doing any kind of an accounting violation or you don't have proper internal controls, you may also violate the US tax law, which explicitly prohibits tax deductions for bribes, such as false sales commissions, deductions, which are intended to conceal corrupt payments. Broadly speaking, payments made to officials or employees of the foreign government that are not deductible for US tax purposes if the payments are unlawful under the FCPA. Payments made to officials or employees of any government other than foreign government are not deductible in the US tax purposes if the payments constitute as an illegal bribe or illegal kickback. Similarly, there are no deductions allowed for US tax purposes for any payments made to a person who is not an officer or employee of a government if the payments constitute as illegal bribes, kickbacks, or illegal payments under any law of the US or under any generally enforced law of the state that subjects the payer to a criminal penalty or the loss of license or privilege to engage in trade or business. So under the US international tax regulation, there is also a regime called the Subpart F regime, which has a specific rule under section 952A4, which says that any illegal bribes, kickbacks, or other payments made by or on behalf of the controlled foreign corporation or a related party subsidiary of a US parent company, they cannot take deductions or they cannot claim deductions in the US tax returns, and they will have to report that income in the US tax return and make sure that proper taxes are paid for those illegal bribes, kickbacks that are paid in the foreign jurisdiction. So that's in a nutshell what people have to focus, companies have to focus from internal accounting perspective, tax perspective, and making sure the books and records are kept properly. So over to you, Deepak.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks so much. Amy, I don't know whether we have questions on the chat box, but if you don't mind, please.
Sure.
Additional questions, but why don't you go ahead, please?
Sure. So first, let me just remind everyone that if you do have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box in order to minimize noise. We'll keep everyone on mute and allow you to put your questions through there. I don't think we've received any yet, but I'll continue to monitor the chat box in case some come through. In the meantime, first of all, thank you to all of our speakers for a really interesting sort of opening discussion. I'd like to follow up with some of you on some of the questions. So Keshav, if I can start with you, what I think I found most interesting about your comments was the balance of trying to continue to operate business continuity in very different operating conditions, and how even though there may be the desire to sort of speed things up or cut corners in order to get the same outcome in the COVID conditions, that we really need to be very careful about keeping all of the sort of commensurate protections in place, and as you alluded to, the trusting relationship. So I wanted to get your sense, first of all, have the lockdowns created a delay in the sort of review process and internal investigations? But also, what things do you keep in mind as you try to balance business continuity in this new normal versus the need to make sure that you are complying and staying abreast of all of the regulations? How do you balance that?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question because, as I mentioned, these are extraordinary times, extraordinary business pressure to deliver, to perform, to sustain, profitability, and also to ensure that you're keeping your ecosystem, customers, and partners, healthy and compliant. And I think in these times, companies and corporations have a great responsibility to ensure that they're going that extra mile to connect with their people and to also understand what are the new risks that are emerging because of the lockdown conditions that we have. And you are definitely engaging, supporting customers, and also doing your business with your customers and partners in a very different environment. And then you are not able to go and meet and kind of do things which you do in a normal course of audit or normal course of vetting. And that's where it's important that we are keeping an absolutely a fine sight around what are the emerging threats and what are the emerging risks that we are seeing in our ecosystem, both in the supply chain side, in the transaction side, in the overall business payments, as well as closing deals, and how much awareness do we create within our ecosystem, especially with our people, with our managers, with our senior management, to keep an eye, absolutely be alert about as they go through their performance journey. And that is where I think we are leveraging technology a lot, first of all, to instill that confidence, imparting a lot more training that we are giving to our people as well as to our partners and focus on the supply chain, constituents. But I think overall, what we are seeing is that it has investigations definitely kind of are the ones which, are not happening at the same pace as they would happen in the normal times. Mm-hmm. We are taking extra care, as we say, because it's not about the investigators who have to look for information, find the gaps and find the violations and understand the risks, but to actually get the confidence in the system for people to cooperate, for people to speak up, people to share, and that's an extra mile effort that we are putting, a lot of synergies to make sure that when cases come up or escalations, come up, how we can have people really support those investigations, so we can continue to, because this remote working is going to, in a hybrid working environment, I think will stay for a long time. Yeah. And we are absolutely prepared through technology, through our commitment, and ensuring that everyone shoulders the responsibility on compliance. It just cannot be, the compliance teams and legal teams and finance teams' responsibility. Everyone has to be fully on board what compliance measures are necessary and how you absolutely operate with ethics and integrity.
Yeah, it's interesting in this new normal, as you said, this will continue for some time, how investigators and different authorities may look at some of the unique conditions imposed by COVID and take those into account or not in their investigations in the future. So I think we may even see 12 to 18 months from now a new kind of spurge of cases, investigations as a result of some of the unique conditions here, and how those will play out will be interesting. Eric, if I could turn to you to also kind of play on this theme of the new normal. And I think as companies start to look at new markets and diversifying their supply chain, they often enter a new market first by working with a distributor, a local partner in the jurisdiction, as opposed to perhaps entering the jurisdiction themselves. So I wanted to get your sense on how responsible a company may be for a distributor if they're just having that type of partnership, and how you ensure that your distributors get on board with your compliance program.
That is a fabulous question because it is so common for companies, either new entrants or plenty of folks who've been in markets for a long time use the distributors to extend their reach in those locations. So, but it is absolutely critical that you know who you're dealing with when you're working with a distributor. And so the onboarding process is hugely important. So you really need to do your diligence. And there are service providers out there who will help you do your diligence and figure out if the company that you're selling agent or distributor you're evaluating is the right kind of business. One very low cost option that a lot of people don't necessarily turn to is, and they should think about hard if you're US based company, is the US Foreign Commercial Service. So they can do a very, very low cost, $100, something like that, to check to see whether a company that you're thinking about working with is registered properly. And you can also get them to do a slightly more robust check, actually go to the company's physical location and do some more research to see whether they are, legitimately a legitimate business doing, business legally in country and what their reputation is. And then there is your own diligence that you should be doing internally. So, how, if you have some local folks, you should have them asking questions. Domestically, you should have, most companies have or should have a diligence checklist that they go through. So, it hits some of the high points to make sure you're doing that. The other piece of this, in addition to just doing the diligence on your third-party provider, is also allocating risk properly. So your written agreement with that distributor should notify them about your expectations on the FCPA side and local corruption rules, and also make sure that if the contract spells out that if they're violating rules, that they're responsible for those violations. And that can be really helpful if there's an enforcement case. If your company didn't have knowledge and didn't authorize what your distributor was up to, and didn't have red flags to see about their activity in paying bribes to foreign officials, you can waive that risk allocation document, the distributor agreement, at the U.S. authorities and say, look, this is not our issue. It is the distributor's issue, and you need to look at them harder than you need to look at us. And so that's not important just for U.S. companies. It's also important for companies that are based outside of the U.S. that are subject to these rules.
Thank you for that. And I think that, that sort of also makes sense in terms of how companies are thinking about and protections they ought to take when they enter in with new jurisdictions or new partners. I'm going to ask Rahul and Raj one final question each. I'm actually going to ask Devika to go ahead and mute everyone again, because I think we're getting a little bit of background noise. So if she wants to mute everyone, and then I'll take myself off of mute again. Devika, could you please mute everyone? Okay, I think we got the background noise. I'll unmute myself. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So Rahul, one quick question for you, and then Raj, I'm going to come back to you too. I know we're coming up against the hour, but I think this is a really fascinating conversation, and if I can ask our speakers to stay with us just a few minutes longer. Rahul, I wanted to ask a little bit about what Indian companies are doing. What do Indian corporates typically do to comply with anti-corruption and bribery? And in particular, Eric had mentioned that in the US, if they do have a policy on the shelf and hopefully it hasn't collected too much dust on it, or they have some training, that would be enough to at least cover or help mitigate some of the concerns in case there was an issue down the road. In India, is the same sort of practice applied, and what do you advise Indian corporates in terms of measures they should take to abide by these practices?
Yeah, thanks, Ami. I think it's a very good question. So unlike in US, we have seen the US companies, they have a proper code of conduct and they have the proper written agreements which they enter with the distributor and with the third party intermediaries. There are handful. So we have seen maybe the listed companies on the stock exchanges are the companies which have a very higher net worth. Those sort of companies do copy the same US model, whereby they will have all those undertakings in the contract that the supplier will not indulge in any corrupt practices. They will also have a training program where they will say that under the Prevention of Corruption Act, you cannot bribe a public servant, which is a government official, and they take the written undertakings from them. But it's like basically for the listed companies they do, and also for the companies having the higher net worth. But this whole process, all the private companies are having very small companies. They do not do the same exercise. But this helps because what happens is that once you are in the court or once an investigation starts in India, and if you go to the investigator, law enforcement, and show them that this is what you have already done, this is what the diligence is, you have told them that this was your compliance program, but apart from that, these guys have been indulged in corrupt practices. So that helps basically, then the law enforcement will look at you like, yes, you are the good guys, in spite of the fact that you put all this robust program. But you had no knowledge that your supplier or distributor is involved in that. So that helps as a defense in the court of law.
Right. Okay. That's helpful to know. And I guess then, both in the US and India, the idea would be for corporates that the more structure you put around some of these laws and the more kind of, official policies, official statements in your contracts, the better it's going to be for protecting you. So I think it's good on both sides. Raj, if I can close with you, I know we're getting up towards the end, and you provided us some really fascinating guidance on not just the behavioral or the contractual part of the FCPA, but the monetary and the accounting side. But I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit more. Does the FCPA Act provide any specific guidance to implement internal controls on the accounting side? And how would you advise companies to handle the internal controls for accounting in terms of complying with FCPA?
So the guidance for the internal control is not really clear by the FCPA. But what we always advise our clients is to make sure that whenever you're looking at monitoring your internal control, make sure that any transactions that you're reporting in your books and records are properly, characterized, are properly reported. Say, for example, you may be paying some kind of a bribe, to a foreign country or to the government officials. But a lot of times we have seen that the companies will take those money and they'll plug it into other expenses, not giving clear, detailed guidance on what those bribes was paid for. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do, and we tell our clients, is make sure that whenever you are doing any transaction with a foreign country or you're managing your books and records at a foreign country, be detailed about your transaction. Make sure that every transaction is reported correctly. Don't just take those numbers and plug it into a different accounting expense. Try to hide that number. And that's what the internal control is, where we come in and we monitor and we try to set it up in such a way that you're not only looking at your books and records from the US side, but also in the foreign country. You have to follow the accounting standards of the foreign country. Right. But make sure that is followed as per the US standard as well. Because the FCPA is overlooking at not only at your US entity, but your foreign entity also, which can get triggered, at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think detailing that is always helpful because you're never going to remember a year before or 2 years before, all of that. And I found it somewhat humorous in your comment earlier about how you could get into double trouble if you find yourself in a problem with a bribe, but then also claim a tax deduction on that. And I thought, well, that's really bold, but I'm sure it happens. So yeah,
companies are overlooking into that because they will set up their accounting books and records in the US and the subsidiaries abroad.
Right.
But they will also they will try to set up their internal controls, but they overlook the tax aspect.
Right.
So there is a tax aspect under Section 162 and the 954 that says that any illegal bribes, kickbacks that you are paying in a foreign country, you got to report that properly. And you have to make sure that you're not claiming any deductions, because you're not only violating the US tax rules, but you're also violating the FCPA rules, because that is overseeing that, if you ever get up for audit. So that tax aspect is very important.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for our speakers. I know I had some technical issues in the beginning. I know we talked a lot today about the new normal and dealing with some of the legal implications. I joke, sometimes it's my kids, sometimes it's my dogs, and today it was computer problems. So I want to appreciate everyone's indulgence for me while I had a bit of a technical hiccup this morning. But we're so grateful, Raj, Keshav, Eric, Deepak, and Rahul for joining us, providing us some of this guidance. I want to remind everyone that today's session isn't official legal advice, but I know that a lot of these folks would be happy to answer questions for you and be in touch with you if you do have more questions. I also want to remind everyone that today's program was recorded and we will put it up on the USIVC YouTube channel as well as out on some of our social media so that you can rewatch if you didn't catch it all. I also see Mr. Anoop from the Indian Embassy here on my screen, so I just want to acknowledge him and say hello. Thank you, sir, for joining us, as well as I know a number of other U.S. government folks as well. We look forward to working with you. And again, if there's any other questions, you can be in touch with me or any of our speakers. And I wish everyone a good morning if you're joining us from the U.S. and good evening. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.